Next is, how can we understand supply and demand changes on the markets? We use a technique called comparative static analysis, where we find one equilibrium and we forecast what will happen when these changes occur. And the first example is if we look at changes in demand. So if there is only a change in demand, we would expect to see a rise in equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. If there's a demand decrease, then we would see a lowering price and lowering quantity. So here's an example we'll do graphically is suppose that the consumer incomes are projected to rise by 2.5%. So the number of individuals that are over 25 years of age will want to rent cars because they're eligible to rent cars at age 25. So what will we think would happen to the rental car market if we see an increase in the incomes and kind of a rising number of people that are 25 years old? The example here would be captured with an equilibrium today, and then the scenario where we project an increase in the demand for rental cars, which would show the demand curve shifting to the right, and we'll assume that supply stays the same. And if this were to occur, we would then drive up the price of the cars because we have more demand, same supply. So demand would go up, causing more quantity at a higher price. And that's the example with a change in demand only. What if we look at changes in supply? Well, if we increase supply, we'd expect the price could go down and the quantity to go up. If we cut back the supply, we'd expect the equilibrium price to go up and the decrease in quantity. So here's an example that we'll do. And this is Congress. And we'll say that there's a bill before Congress that will require all employers to provide health care to workers. And what would be the impact on retail markets? We pick on retail markets because that's where low wage earners exist, and therefore it would greatly impact the number of people working or hired to work in retail stores. All right, so this is equilibrium before the change, and let's say that the bill is this is not enough. We need to increase the benefit packages so everyone has health coverage. It would cause the supply curve to shift to the left because the cost of hiring would be higher. So therefore the amount of supply willing to be sold at a certain price would go down and employment would be reduced. So that is the fear when we have government imposed policies such as healthcare, mandatory healthcare. So what if there's a simultaneous shift in supply and demand? And this is an example of Kobe getting hit by an earthquake, and therefore we have less rice, which is bad for sake because we use rice to make sake. So what happens is when there's an earthquake, perhaps people want to drink more, and yet there's less sake to be made because there's less rice available to make the drink. So the first is the static position where we have equilibrium. Next is what happens when we have simultaneously increase in demand because after an earthquake, people may want to drink. And then the other is there's a shrinkage of supply because there's less rice available to make the sake. So one immediate impact could be that the price of sake rises and the demand for sake rises, right? Leading to higher price, more quantity sold. That's one scenario. But if there's an extremely large constriction of supply of rice and therefore even a lower amount of alcohol available for sake, we might see this happen, where supply shifts way over here, right? That's theoretically possible if there's a massive decrease in rice available. And look what happens to the end result. So rather than have equilibrium price and quantity here and both go up, both quantity and price, here we see that the price goes up by a lot because of the massive shrinkage in supply, but the quantity goes down. So this is a bit of a non-intuitive result, but it could occur if there's such a constriction in supply such that the quantity goes down and the price goes up substantially, right? So that's kind of an odd case, but this graph indicates the possibility of such a massive reduction in sake as to cause a skyrocketing of prices to make it essentially unaffordable. So chapter 2, we have met these learning objectives. First, looking at the law of demand, how that works, what it causes the shift. Then we worked with some linear demand functions to quantify some of the attributes of demand, such as consumer surplus. Then we looked at the law of supply, how producers determine how much they supply, and capturing what is the impact of changes in the supply and their factors or government intervention. We used a supply function to start to quantify some of the measures, such as producer surplus. And finally, we looked at comparative static analysis as a tool to help us understand the impact of changes in supply or demand or both. All right, I'll see you for chapter 3.